relationships are stages for growth. You could do a lot of work on your own, but like doing work when you're like with a partner and being triggered in these ways is like exponential.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Let's Talk Relationships. Today we are doing something a little different than our past episodes. Today I'm going to be joined by an expert psychologist, and we're going to be talking about the attachment theory. Something that has changed my life entirely, and so I really wanted to bring someone on today who, one, is an expert and can speak about it better than I can, and two, it's just been really groundbreaking for me. Back in 2019, I had a friend who shared this book called Attached with me, and I didn't read it right away, but she had told me she was just coming off a really, really horrible divorce, and she said reading this book completely changed her life and changed her perspective on everything that was going on. And so it had been in my Audible for years. And back in 2022, it was the summer 2022, I picked up the book and I decided to read it. And it also completely changed my perspective on myself, on dating, on how I pursued people. And it just brought so much light into my own patterns and my behaviors in relationships that I didn't love. And I just couldn't figure out, why do I feel this way? Why do I act this way, you know? And so, it was so life-changing for me that I knew on this podcast, like, we have to bring someone on to talk about this. And so today I'm joined by Dr. Alexia Holovatyk. Did I say it right? Holovatyk. I wasn't even close. I practiced before and I still didn't get it. I'm so grateful.
It's a tricky one.
Right? And we don't edit this, so that's going to be live. But
Totally.
I'm so excited to have you on. I love, by chance, we had literally met. I think we met at the Penmar Sunset Sessions, and then later at like beach tennis, we were chatting, and then I didn't realize that she was a psychologist, and then I went on her Instagram page and saw all this, and I was like, oh my god, you would literally be the perfect guest because you specialize in this topic, and I think this is a big part of your practice. So welcome, and thank you for coming on and being willing to chat with us. So yeah, tell us a little bit.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about you and your practice and kind of what you focus on.
Yeah, so I started my own practice a little over a year ago called Live Well Psychology Group. And so, since then I've been working with women individually, and I also work with couples. And I will say that no matter what people come into therapy for, ultimately everybody talks about love and relationships. It's just inevitable.
Yes.
It's who we are as people. So I use a lot of emotion-focused therapy, and kind of at the core of that it's basically a lot of like attachment theory. So it's something that I use with people frequently, and I kind of will just second what you say, that getting insight into like your patterns and like making your unconscious conscious about why you're attracted to certain things that you have, or why you keep repeating patterns. A lot of this like kind of all goes back to attachment theory.
Amazing. So I guess let's start there. What is attachment theory for the layman's terms?
Yeah. So let me I'm just going to ask you a question, if that's okay.
Course.
If you can, let's take it all the way back to like when we're born. So what do you think like a newborn baby, their number one need is when they're born?
They rely so much on their mother, and it's going to be obviously food, love, care, affection, all those things. Feeling safe. I think that's a big thing as a child, is you're constantly like, I need to feel safe. I need to feel loved. I need to feel cared for.
Yeah, because when you're a newborn baby, you literally cannot do anything for yourself. You are completely dependent on someone else loving you and taking care of you for survival.
Yeah.
So that's why when we get to things like relationships, and it just feels like these emotions we feel around them, like the highs and the lows, they can feel so dramatic because they're really, like, you take it all the way back, they're really rooted in survival. And that need to bond with somebody is the number one thing that we need. It kind of precedes everything, all the other needs like food, shelter. We need someone to take care of us. And so that's what we kind of learn, like from the time that we're born through our early childhood years. and kind of as we're developing and being raised. And also beyond that too, it's like initially our attachment figures are caregivers when we're children and babies. And the need to be loved and cared for by somebody, it doesn't just go away when you're an adult. It usually transfers to like a romantic partner, because we are a social species and we need that kind of connection, usually to survive. So it's a really like deeply ingrained biological drive. And so we kind of learn early on what is love and what does it mean to be bonded to somebody and attached to somebody through our interactions with our caregivers.
Yeah.
So there's some really early research by like Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth that kind of grouped these different ways of attaching to your caregivers into 4 segments. So if you want, I can jump into that.
Yeah, we'd love. Yeah, so these are going to be the 4 segments, which is essentially each of the different attachment styles that someone could have.
Yeah. So there's like 4 main attachment styles. So there's anxious or preoccupied. So there's like 3 insecure ones, and then there's securely attached. Right. So I'll kind of go over the insecure ones first. So there's anxious or preoccupied.
Before we even get into those, in like one sentence, like how would you describe like what is attachment? So is it how we've attached to our mothers, and that's how we attach today with our partners? What is that really at the core of what it is?
I think if we were to sum it up, it's what you've learned about how much can I rely on another person?
Okay.
How safe is it to connect with another person?
Okay, love that. Okay, and then that breaks down into 4 different styles of attachment that we can fall into.
Yeah. So there's like anxious or preoccupied. There's avoidant or dismissive. And there's this like what we call a disorganized or fearful avoidant category that's a little bit of a mix of those 2. Mm-hmm. And then there's the secure attachment. So if you like a really quick like acronym to think about the qualities that you need to kind of repeat over and over to develop a secure attachment with somebody, there's a little acronym I use called ARE. So is that person available? Are they responsive? And are they engaged? Right. So you can even imagine, let's say there's like, you're a little kid and you're walking down the street with your mom and this big dog walks by and you've never seen a dog this big. And so you get really scared, and how your caregiver interacts with you, and how like your experience of interacting with them over and over and over again kind of puts you on these paths of different attachment styles. Mm-hmm. Right. So in one case, like if you're securely attached, your mom might notice that you're scared. She's really attuned to you, mm-hmm. and she sees that your eyes get really big and you kind of tense up, and she kind of automatically steps in and says, "It's okay, sweetie. Like, it's just a dog." Maybe she gets on your level and maybe she sits there with you in that, or maybe she picks you up, right? She's attuned to kind of see what your emotional response mm-hmm. is and respond to that in a comforting way, right? So there might be like an initial fear, and then you can like use your caregiver to use that bond to help regulate yourself. Mm-hmm. Let's say there's like the anxious attachment figure. So, your mom might not be really noticing. So you might feel that initial fear, like you might tense up, your eyes might get big, and your mom's not paying attention or something, right? And so you're like, okay, maybe I have to get a little bit bigger to really get the care that I'm needing from my parents. So maybe it like escalates into like screaming or crying. Mm-hmm. And then maybe your mom pays attention, or maybe it's really inconsistent. Like sometimes your parents, I don't want to just say mom all the time, but parents can attune to your needs. Sometimes they don't. Mm-hmm. So it's like this question of, am I going to get my needs met? And usually I have to get really big or like yell or get really distressed, right? It's not like someone is just like kind of like so tuned into me mm-hmm. that they're helping me regulate. I have to be very big with my emotions in order to get that like bonding experience so that I can feel calm.
Got it.
Right. And then the dismissive or avoidant, like either they're not attuned to you, and let's say you try different strategies to connect or get care from them, and they kind of respond by like just dismissing it, like, oh, that's not scary, stop crying. Or they kind of like there's, even when you try to reach out for connection, it's not given. So you learn to just not even reach out anymore eventually, right? Because there's no point. We don't continue strategies that haven't been useful or fruitful. So they really just learn to like regulate themselves and kind of do it on their own. Because when they try to reach out, it's not met with like closeness and comfort and care. And the last category is it's like this one, it's like the disorganous one, and it's kind of really categorized by just confusion. So this could be when like your interactions with your caregivers are frightening. So you kind of associate getting care and love with something that's a little scary. Maybe they yell very frequently. It could be as extreme as like abuse. It doesn't have to be, right? It could just be this like kind of, it's disorienting. Sometimes they're really invasive and like highly anxious, and sometimes they're just like checked out and not there. You just never know what you're going to get. And so it's like this, what am I, right? There's like no solid ground to stand on with it. It's really confusing, like what you're going to get at what time. And so then you might see this like both kind of like anxious and avoidance kind of in one.
Yeah. It's like that, kind of like that push-pull scenario.
Yeah.
Caregivers.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And so, a lot of times people are confused about intimacy. It's like, I want it, but it also feels bad when I have it, but I want it. I don't want it. It's like this hot and cold.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure it produces a lot of fear, because once they have it, they're like, this is too much. And now I have to push away. But then when they push it away, they're like, I want it and I want to move close. So it's this like, this constant, ebb and flow with that. And so with that, how does this really play out in our adult lives? Because I think, this is something that definitely, like you mentioned, stems from our childhood and how we attach to our parental figures. And it's just crazy. When I first learned about this, I was like, oh my gosh, it's crazy to think that like what I learned then as a kid is now affecting me as an adult. And it's like when I'm in those moments of, I'm on the anxious side. So when I'm in those moments of being anxious, I started recognizing like, oh my goodness, it's like this little girl in me is coming out in those moments, And that's for me what totally changed my perspective, because I was like I could just see her. I could see her on the playground, and I could be like, I could see that, oh my gosh, she's scared. Like she's anxious. She's like, why aren't people talking to me? Or why is this not happening? And then, it kind of creates this level of anxiety. And it was just so interesting to see like, oh, it's just a scared little girl confronting, a confusing situation, and so it's so interesting. So I'm, from your perspective, like how does this come out, in our adult lives, especially in obviously romantic relationships, but this also comes out in friendships. So just in general, like how do you see this kind of play out in our lives?
Yeah. And I just want to like reiterate your point of thinking about this in terms of like inner child work or inner child healing work is so powerful, because it really is just that little kid in all of us crying out for the things that they didn't get, that they really like needed when they were little and they didn't have. And so being able to kind of go back and see it from that lens as an adult and in a way give them what they wanted is so healing.
Yeah.
So it's super powerful work.
Yeah, I went through that this last year, and it's been life-giving, going through that and understanding, because in those moments it's made me realize like, oh, I'm okay, I'm safe, I'm fine, because in those moments of pure anxiety, you're just like, are they going to call? Are they going to text? Is this going to happen? And you just start to recognize like, oh, I'm okay. Like that what's going on in my head is something I'm creating, and it's like I'm safe within myself. I'm good. And so, it was really powerful to start diving into that work. Obviously for me, it's like, I see it as you don't just dive into it once. This comes up multiple times in your lives. And so, It's like a
Yeah. And I know this is probably jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll just even one step further of like seeing that little girl and you can actively take steps to comfort her. So
yes.
this is something like my therapist would tell me is like, oh, sweetie, I see you, right? Like I see that you're really like wanting this attention right now, or you could really like relate to yourself like in the way that you would have wanted to when you were a
Yeah.
kid, which is so there's a really like I think like active healing component to this
Yeah.
that is it's a felt experience, which is like where the magic happens
Yeah.
rather than just intellectually knowing.
Yeah.
It kind of can go deeper than that, which is really cool.
Yeah, and you get to be compassionate toward that little girl or
Yeah.
little boy. You know, you see them with compassion, and you don't see it as like, oh, I blame my parents, or I blame. It's just looking at that and being like, and looking at her and being like, oh, I'm sorry you didn't get what you needed. You know, and it's like it's being able to talk to her and remind her that she's okay and she's worthy and she's loved, and you know, all those things. And yeah, that's what that work has done. And that work wouldn't have started for me if I hadn't learned about the attachment theory, to be honest. Like I think that was like the first point where I was like, oh, so much of my patterns are coming from my childhood, of things that I wasn't aware of, didn't never addressed, didn't even know was connected to how I showed up in relationships, you know, and what it was like on the receiving end of that. I think that was also eye-opening, was like, oh, what does that feel like for the other person when I'm anxious? You know, how does that come off to somebody else? And so you start to like really look at it, you know, not just from your perspective of like, oh, I'm feeling this way, but it can, for me, what I noticed was it can put pressure on a relationship. I think when you're dealing with these sort of things, and for me, it was, you know, I wasn't aware, but in looking back, I was like, wow, that puts a lot of pressure on your partner to try and heal those things. Because essentially that's what you're doing, is you're trying to go to your partner to fulfill these things, you know, so I don't feel anxious, so I don't feel this way, which isn't necessarily a bad thing inherently, because you obviously have needs, but it's to the degree that we rely on our partner, I think can be unhealthy for these things.
Yeah. Like, is it, there's obviously like appropriate levels that we want to rely on our partner and that we have expectations of our partner. It's like a healthy dependency, but you just want to check, like, am I at an 8 and the situation calls for a 4?
Exactly.
So just kind of like always checking for these like right-sized reactions, you know, and you kind of mentioned, how does this play out in relationship? It's like, so your partner, let's say they didn't text you back for, you know, multiple hours, and you're feeling a certain way about that. And remember, as a kid, you've learned you really had to escalate when you need something. And so you kind of just, oh my God, you didn't text me back. Like, you don't care about me. You might just kind of like come off really hot to this person. And they're kind of like, whoa, like, where's all this? Rather than, you know, knowing that, or really like trusting that you can express what you want to someone, and that can actually be heard and seen and met with just a really calm, right? Like, you have these like new healing experiences.
Yeah.
You know, somebody can see you're distressed, and you could just communicate that, and they can actually respond, is like, whoa, it's like this huge light bulb moment that I don't have to get so big in order for someone to really care what I'm going through or to see me.
Yeah.
You know, it's like my needs can be met. It's just a really different experience.
Yeah, and it teaches you, I think, once you dive more into it and understand your own personal triggers when it comes to attachment and your attachment style, it also gives you an opportunity to learn how to communicate your needs, because your needs are still important, right? Like, I know I need communication. Like, for me, I need consistency in communication, you know, and that's something I just, you know, it creates safety for me. It creates trust for me, you know, and it's like, now I've learned, oh, I just can come out and express that initially. Like, hey, if you're not going to be available for a day, or you're, you know, just let me know. Hey, you're not going to hear from me today. I've got this is going on. Great. And then it immediately shuts down, you know, any form of anxiety. But that's what it taught me, is like, I can't have these expectations of someone if I haven't actually explained to them what I need. So in doing that work and in digging in that, I learned, like, I can come and express, because I think for being anxious, I was, as a kid, I think I was always scared to ask my parents for anything like that. Like, I never was like, hey, I need more affection, or I need this more consistent. Like,
you probably didn't even know that's what, you didn't even know you needed that to ask for it.
Exactly, you know? Right. And so as an adult, you kind of get used to not asking for these things. You just kind of expect, well, it doesn't shouldn't everybody just know, So it really allowed me to grow in that area of just being able to communicate needs and being able to allow someone to actually meet them after I've expressed, the need.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
So I'm curious too, with each separate style, I'd love if you could give us kind of examples of how it shows up in a romantic relationship. I think that will really help people kind of understand, like, how does this play out in our relationships, in our, kind of in our day-to-day interactions? How do you see them in a big picture play out?
Yeah. So, I would say, like, for each of the insecure attachment styles, there might be a really high desire for connection.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of like actual intimacy
Mm-hmm.
of to the bone, being seen by somebody in your totality, like, and seeing someone else for who they are in their totality, I would say intimacy is actually threatening for each of those insecure attachment styles, because it's so interesting, because it's like sometimes the thing you want most, you might think like, I want intimacy more than anything. But if that hasn't been your experience, where you haven't like had the experience of like feeling unconditional love and getting your needs met consistently, it still feels foreign.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we get it, it actually feels kind of icky.
Yeah.
Right. So
right.
It's like
I've experienced that.
And so it's like let's say you're let's just pick anxious, since you brought that up. You could be thinking like, all I want is someone who's like giving me all this attention, who is just calm and consistent and available to me. But you might get that and you're like, I'm not really interested in that, right? Like, because there's a part of you that like wants this chase almost. Like there's like, you've learned that like it needs to be hard. You don't just get love and attention. Like you have to work for it. You have to do something for it. So you kind of maybe pick somebody who reinforces that, who's not going to just give you that like love and attention just on a silver platter on the first date.
Yeah.
Right. So you kind of like pick what's familiar. You pick what you know. And I also think you're naturally drawn to people who is, and this all happens on such an unconscious level. It's not like we all walk around with like name tags, like talking about our attachment styles.
I wish we did. No, I'm kidding.
You don't need to, because your subconscious just knows. Like that spark that you feel with someone, like when you like walk into your room and you're like, oh, it's on. Like, oh yeah, you're just like magnets to that person.
Right? Avoidance are my jam. Every time I can pick them out. Like now I know, but man, I can pick those guys out like no tomorrow.
They don't need to even be wearing signs, right? It's like you can just smell them out. But it's like, because I think your subconscious is really trying to create healing experiences for you.
Yeah.
You naturally are drawn to people who just, you have this little sense that like they will help you with your own personal evolution. Without consciousness, that can kind of blow up and be not a good thing. It can be really dysfunctional. But if you're bringing consciousness to it, like, yeah, that person that you're drawn to them because they're like triggering you left and right. Yeah. And it's like your subconscious being like, oh, these are opportunities to learn and grow here and here and here and here.
Yeah. And it's also to reiterate the story that I am enough. And that's something I realized was I'd go after these guys that were much more avoidant because, yeah, it triggered me. But it also, I had this story in my head that like, but for me, they'll call, they'll do this. So it's like, I'd ask for the need and then I'm like, oh, they finally met it. And it was like this, it just was reiterating the story that was in my head that like, okay, you are enough for someone to do that for, right? And so it's like, I always feel like
it's this like wound of not being enough.
Yes.
Right. And if somebody just gives that to you, it's like, well, they must not be that great if they're just giving this
and
to
it's
me.
Well, and it's momentary. Right? It's like the satisfaction I would get from an avoidant finally calling, finally texting. It's momentary. But it was like I read a study or was it in a book? They talk about like just the psychological like what happens. It's almost like a high. Like it is a there's a term for it. I'm just blanking on it right now, but like your brain, it's a high for you to get that text, to finally get that call. Like it becomes almost like a drug, And so
Yeah.
it's just, it was fascinating to read that and to
Definitely
understand
like
that.
releasing some neurotransmitters there, some
Yes.
happy neurotransmitters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, you just tend to repeat what you know subconsciously, which is
Yeah.
crazy.
And if you think about it, like for an anxious person, they feel so much and it kind of just like it's all these like big feelings. So when they see someone who's avoidant, who's like a little more close to the vest and kind of cool, calm, and collected, there's part of them that's like, man, I wish I could be like that.
Yeah.
Right? Like I wish I could just be so like solid in myself. And then there's maybe, let's talk about the avoidant person for a little bit, who, it's not like they have any less need for attachment than any of the rest of us.
Yeah. It's like the commonality between all of them is everyone wants to feel, attached and wanted and intimacy. Like we all crave that as humans. It's like,
yeah, exactly. But and sometimes they don't even know that they want it because they just haven't been. Think about how painful it is to kind of ask for a need, like ask for comfort as a kid and to not get it over and over again. It becomes so painful that you shut down to that. You kind of build up a wall against that. And you're like, well, I don't need it anyway. Well, because you're not getting it anyway. So yeah, you tell yourself you don't need it. But that need is still there. And so when you see this, like they see it like an anxious person or whatever, I'm being really like generalized here, but who are having all these emotions, like that's appealing too. It's like, I don't have these like ups and downs in my emotions, right? At least not on the surface, right? And so there's kind of like, there's an element of you that like, I feel like I could maybe learn from and help me move towards center. And there's an element of you that I can maybe learn from and help me move towards center. It's like these, I think at the end of the day too, like we see this in nature, but nature always goes towards homeostasis. There's like always this drive towards like balancing an ecosystem, right? And so anxious avoidant is like a nice balance, right? In terms of like, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's functional all the time. Like we can find homeostasis and dysfunction. It's just less common to see like avoidant and avoidant people ending up in relationship together because it's like, who's really pressing the gas to make this thing go, right? Like they're kind of each, like where's the glue? Like they're kind of each doing their own thing. Obviously, you still see it. It happens. It's just less common. And like anxious can also feel like a lot of emotion in the room, right? And so these things kind of tend to balance each other out. And like even, but if you think of like secure attachment, people with secure attachments, they might get together with somebody who is anxious and then just be like, this doesn't maybe suit me. It's a little, right? It's like a little, whatever you want to call it. Like it just, there's not really like if you think about like how we're all drawn towards growth and healing, there might not be as much of a draw and those relationships might not go as far. Or like with an avoidant and they're just like, this feels weird. Like I'm not feeling this connection. Like, okay, I'm going to move on too. There's not this like, you have to think about it in terms of like who you're drawn to as like being glue.
Yeah.
And there has to be something in it in terms of growth for both parties in order for that like glue to happen.
For sure. Yeah. And so in that spectrum, so everybody knows who maybe are just totally unfamiliar with this, and this is just in very broad terms, but the anxious desperately wants to hold on to the connection. Like they crave it, they want it. To them, it's like their lifeline, right? I think avoidance want that connection, may not know they want that connection, but it is a deep desire, but there's a lot of fear connected to the connection. So they tend to withdraw a lot more than like an anxious person. An anxious person will push in more, avoidance will withdraw a lot more. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, and I would make a distinction between like connection, because like everybody can want connection, right? Like going out on having an amazing date with somebody or having sex with somebody, like these things can all be connection. But when I talk about intimacy, I mean like seeing somebody like a 360 view of them, and like, right, like you're seeing the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Like you're known by them. There's like a knowing.
You're known by them.
Yeah, which is a lot. Exactly. Like you said, I think that's a great distinction. It's a lot. It's intimate. It's a lot closer. There's more room to be hurt. There's the ability to be hurt. Sometimes with connections, they can be they're a little more distant. They're not I think there's less, it's like there's less likely to be really hurt by someone. I think there's always that fear that someone's going to, like, I think for the anxious, it's like you feel like you're going to be more abandoned by that person and it'll hurt more.
And I think that, it's funny, like, as much as we're different, the more we're alike.
Sure.
At the end of the day, because especially working with couples, like the perception is that there's just kind of this like wall of like, I can't get through to the avoidant partner.
Yeah.
And really, I think there's a lot happening underneath the surface there.
Yeah.
Because the avoidant partner wants and needs that connection just as much as the anxious person in the relationship. Yeah. And they're just as scared to lose it. Especially when we're talking like beyond the dating stages and into like, okay, we're like in relationship, that like when the avoidant partner maybe like gets bigger and maybe more attacking verbally or whatever, or critical, like, you never do this for me. Like, there's just, it's a threat to the avoidant person. And so how they respond to threat is by shutting down.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, I can't make my partner happy. I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to shut down. And sometimes that like shut down can be perceived as not caring when that's not the case.
Yeah.
Right. It's just, how do we respond to threats? Do we get bigger? It's like fight or flight.
Yeah.
So the withdrawing is more flight, and the like anxious is more like fight. Like, I'm going to fight for this connection.
Yeah. And then they tend, like you were mentioning earlier, they tend to find one another. They're the most common pairings in terms of relationships that you'll see out there. And the crazy thing is they trigger each other the most because they have opposite, I'd call them needs, or opposite ways they attach. So for an anxious person, when someone withdraws, that makes them just want to push in harder and go in more. And the more the anxious person goes in, the more the avoidant wants to withdraw, right? And then opposite,
Yeah, you named it.
Yeah.
That cycle is called the more, the more.
Yeah.
The more I get bigger, the more that they shrink. And the more that they shrink, the bigger I get.
Yeah.
It's like the more, the more. So it kind of goes around in this dance.
Yeah. And oftentimes
until you bring some level of awareness to it.
Exactly. And yeah, I was gonna say, we're talking in terms of two people being completely, totally unaware of these patterns. And this can go on, they call it the push-pull. This can go on for years in relationships where people do this constantly, And like I said earlier, it can be like a drug, because the minute the avoidant comes back, then the anxious person's like, oh my God, this is great, right? And then if the anxious person starts to withdraw a little bit, being like, okay, fine, maybe they just then the avoidant person kind of comes back. So then it becomes this constant, back and forth,
Well, and like I said, again, like, instead of there being true intimacy there, which can just maybe feel really like calm and stable and like, oh, we're just like sitting on the couch together in peace and really like being with each other deeply. Yeah. This cycle is a distraction from that.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's like these highs and lows that are almost just like a red herring of like, what would it really feel like to sit in your rawness and in your vulnerability with another person without that kind of distraction? So oftentimes that like cycle that you're describing, it could be something for your brain to be occupied with, because like the really scary thing is sitting in your vulnerability with another human who has the potential to hurt you.
You said it all. That's exactly it. And that's the hard part, is sitting in that. Because it's so scary. It's like you're taking, I feel like it's like I'm taking off all my shields, all my protection, everything. Because, it is a protection mechanism in a way. It's like how we figured out as kids to survive, right? And it's like you start taking all that off and you kind of just feel like you're just like naked standing there like, okay, this is me. Like, I have to kind of lay all that out. And even owning like I am terrified that you are going to abandon me or leave me. Like, that is something so hard to say and so deep. Like, it's a deep-seated like pain that we've carried with us since we were kids, And then same with the avoidant, I imagine their deep-seated is, I'm not good enough, Like, I'm not good enough to get my needs met. So why bother telling you what I need? So I rather just withdraw. I rather just not push in,
Yeah, it's funny. I think like when you really get underneath it, there's anxiety on both parts.
100%. It's like the underlying.
Right? It's just the way, it's like a shutdown style versus an activating style. But there's insecurity on both ends.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of being secure, can you describe what that looks like? Like when we're talking about, okay, I'm a secure attachment, in light of, obviously we've gone through the anxious, we've gone through the avoidant. The disorganized is a whole, I think you could do a whole episode on disorganized as well. But just curious, how do you kind of move toward, like, what is being secure, or moving toward security, and how does that play out? What does that look like?
And like let's bring in the disorganized too.
Yeah.
For sure, right? Because like again, like disorganized is associating fear with intimacy. And so but at the same time, being close to your attachment figure is still a comfort, but there's a fear associated with it. So at the end of the day, like we're all moving towards learning that this intimacy is safe and that we're worthy of it. It's like moving from conditional to unconditional love on all fronts. And so I'm really glad, this is like a really great thing to be talking about, because I think that a secure attachment with somebody else starts with creating a secure attachment with yourself. So if we go back to that like acronym of available, responsive, and engaged, even just thinking like, how do I talk to myself? If I'm having an emotion, do I really dismiss it and be like, just push through, you don't need to feel that. Just, oh, you're so stupid for feeling that way, or I can't, like, you're whatever. Like the quality of how we speak to ourselves when we're distressed. Because if I was distressed and I came to you and I'm like, I'm really scared, and you're like, well, that's stupid. Well, I wouldn't come to you anymore when I'm feeling distressed, because that doesn't feel good. And so how do we relate to ourselves when we're distressed, right? Is it that like nurturing, compassionate tone, or are we really hard and critical on ourselves? And so even thinking about like relationship with ourselves and being there for ourselves and not leaving ourselves. And part of not leaving ourselves is like making decisions for ourselves that feel good. Right. And not continually putting ourselves in a situation where we're kind of disappointed and feeling bad over and over again. It really is this like the ultimate parent that we wish that we had, right? Like, are we being protected? Are we being seen? Are we being attuned to? Are we getting the care that we need? And so, like, I guess like monitoring the quality of what that sounds like, that self-talk. And I think even like a cool one that I heard that I never thought about is like what creates these bonds too is like rituals with other people. So like maybe every Saturday you're going to the farmer's market with somebody, or like on holidays or birthdays, you have these like rituals, and you can make those rituals with yourself, which I also think is a good way to bond with yourself.
Yeah. I think that's great. I do those a lot. But it was definitely a learning curve for me in that as well, because I realized I was super critical of myself. Like I was getting frustrated. Why am I anxious? Why do I feel this way? So instead it wasn't helpful. It wasn't helping me move toward being more secure. And I finally met someone who was moving toward being secure. I think he was pretty secure more that I look back on it. And it allowed me to practice a more secure response in many situations. And it was so healing for me, like we were only together like 6 months, but being in that relationship with someone who was open and willing and like, incredibly sweet and just, and willing to have those hard conversations, it really gave me the space and the time to, I had 1 or 2 moments where I was like, ooh, I was not proud of them, but he didn't hold it against me. We talked through them, and it allowed me to grow so much. So I think there is so much beauty too in being able to pair with someone who is maybe on the journey to become more secure, or is just generally more secure, for some, if you're avoidant or if you're anxious. But like you said, you have to be on that path of growing into that. And being aware of your patterns, and being willing to look at them differently with more compassion, with.
Yeah. And I think what you're implying here, but let's just like openly name it. And what people might be wondering is, if I have one of these attachment styles, is that forever? Or can I work towards a secure attachment? And the answer is like, absolutely. We call it an earned secure attachment
Yeah.
style. It does take work, but absolutely you can teach yourself to respond to these things in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I had mentioned that in another episode where initially I was upset that I'm like, well, why am I thought I was healed. Why am I still experiencing the anxiety? And I was like, well, this doesn't make sense. So then I was hard on myself for like why I'm still dealing with it. And I realized, no, it's a matter of how I'm reacting to when I deal with that. What am I doing with those feelings? What am I doing with when that comes up for me? Am I getting bigger, or am I sitting with it, analyzing it, talking to myself like,
Yeah.
is this warranted? I have to go through like, okay, let's say they didn't reply for 6 hours, right? And I'm like, okay, normally I would get a little anxious, but now I'm like, okay, I've repeated to myself, they have told me they care about me. They have been there for me in all these other situations, right? So I have to remind myself of like, no, this is just my own emotions in my head trying to create the story I'm familiar with, right? I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy of being loved. I'm not worthy of someone showing up. This person's going to get up and walk away, So it takes a lot of work. It really does, but it's so worth it because you show up so much better for someone else. Like when I think about my future partner, I'm like, I want to show up as my best version. Like when I meet that person, I want to make sure I'm like, not perfect, but like I'm moving towards showing up better for them,
Yeah. And those triggers are always going to come up. And
Yeah.
like you said, no one's perfect. But like what you're describing too is like, there's different ways to regulate your emotions.
Yeah.
There's like automatic ways, there's self-regulation, there's like external. And so a lot of times, like, I think it's really tempting, especially for someone dealing with anxious attachment style, to do what I call like a hot potato and say, I'm dealing with all these really big emotions. Like, I'm just going to throw it to you and like you deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Rather than you sitting with it.
Yeah.
And I think a really important distinction here is like, what level of commitment has that person like agreed on with you in terms of helping you move through this, right? Because if like, let's say someone doesn't text you back and you're not like a couple, you're not, like you've maybe just been on like a couple of dates, like how appropriate is it to really kind of like toss that person your emotion, versus you dealing with it on your own. But and I would say like once you're in a committed relationship and that person has said like, yeah, like we're in this together, it's also totally appropriate, like once you kind of sit with your emotion to know what it's about, to be able to communicate like, hey, what would help me feel more secure in this? Like if you didn't take 6 hours to text me back, right? And that person's like, oh, like I didn't even think about it. Like, right. So it's this like teaching the other person how to love you.
Yeah.
Because those like tendencies or those like things that we like. So for you and for me too, feeling that like stability and safety in a relationship is super important. And it's always going to be important for me.
Yeah.
We don't have to erase that. It's just learning how to honor what we need in a way that doesn't feel like destructive to the relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And being able to communicate that in a calm, in a calm manner makes such a difference. And and what you had said earlier, I'm talking about this as being in a committed relationship when you're like, okay, we're doing this, we're together, not someone I've been on 2 dates with, right? So I don't.
Oh, and I've been there, and I've learned that for sure. And I look back, and I'm like, oops. That was a little.
Did I say that? Yeah, probably shouldn't. Yeah, and you share like, I need these things, and you're like on date 2, and you're like, yeah, he don't owe you anything.
And it seems like so reasonable in the moment, and then you look back, and you're like, probably not that reasonable, but that's okay. You live and you learn.
Absolutely. Like I think communicating your needs are absolutely important, but I think just being cautious about what point do you communicate those, right? And I think there's ways to communicate, even asking, like if you're like only on date 2 or maybe date 3, like it's still early on, and maybe he's like taking forever to text or call you or whatever, you know. I think even probing the topic with just simple like, hey, so like, are you more of a phone call person or do you like to text? Like, you can kind of gauge without being like, I need you to respond in 2 hours or like coming out of the gate.
Because like
you know,
dating is about knowing whether this is the person that's going to meet your needs and make you feel stable and comfortable. And guess what? That's not everybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so you might ask for something and that person just can't. So it's not about like trying to like force this person to be the person you want. It's about, like seeing, are they the person that they want, like that I want? Can they give me what I need? And really just speaking more of like a slow, curious perspective, and also being okay to call it if it's like they're just someone who doesn't text for 24 hours at a time and that really doesn't work for you. Why are you trying to make that fit? Right? Like, just find someone who like can love you in the ways that you need to be loved too. And that's like what dating is for. So allowing yourself to take that time to get to know the other person really well.
Absolutely. And I think that ties so much into this whole attachment theory we're talking about, because I would recognize like if someone, like I know for me, if someone's very avoidant and maybe not aware and not working on it or isn't able to communicate like, hey, I need space, right? If someone says like, hey, I need the day just to do me, like I'm probably not gonna text call, like I just need to go have a guys, whatever. I'm like, okay, cool. Like I don't even think twice about it when it's communicated. But when it's just like, I don't hear from you for a day or two and there's been no that doesn't work for me. Like it just doesn't. And I know, I'm like, that's just going to throw me into a complete anxious spiral. So it's like, you also have to get to that point where it's like, I can't make an avoidant person want to connect the way I do. I just can't. It's just not in them. And if they're growing toward that and they're able, and you see that they're, willing to do things here, willing to, communicate, hey, I need space. Hey, maybe this is too much connection for me right now. I just need like a moment or whatnot. Then I like you were saying, we have to be willing to cut it and not try. And I think that's where we fall a lot. And I've noticed in myself too, this is why when I learned about attachment, it just like, oh my gosh, it made so much sense to me, because I would try to chase these avoidant guys that like just are avoidant. And like, then I would feel defeated. Like, why isn't this relationship working? Why do I feel this way? Why do I feel so alone in this relationship? And I think now I'm able to put words to it, like, and able to understand like, oh, this is a core wound of theirs. And if they're not aware and not working on it, and also, then it's difficult for me to build a relationship with someone like that. I just know for myself,
Yeah. And I think like at my point in my like healing journey is I'm really learning that connection doesn't have to be hard, which sounds so simple, but it's also so profound when maybe you're used to you're used to having to work for it.
Yeah.
And so if like, that's what I'm really learning is to kind of from jump, like to really pick people who I can see, they don't have to show up as the complete package, but people that really like have the structure or the bones to like be what I like need in a relationship and to like kind of grow with me in that way. And that's really like, it's taken me like a lot of work to get to that place.
Yeah. And it makes dating interesting because I think you start looking at, your list changes. I think when you kind of get to that point, you understand what you need at a core versus, maybe some shared interests that you're like, it doesn't matter anymore. Like it'd be great if we both like to cook, but if we don't, then that's fine, because you start looking at things of like, what do I actually need in a partner to feel safe, to feel secure, and all that, because like it's difficult. Your partner is going to trigger you. I do have to say, like at some point, they're like. You're not going to meet someone who's just never going to trigger you in any capacity. But I think it's understanding, like, how do you guys come back from that? How can you communicate the trigger? Can you talk through it? Can you also self-soothe when you need to? You can't rely entirely on your partner to fulfill all those things. And I think you get to that point, you start to understand. Yeah, you start to understand better of like what works best for you, in terms of their personality, their character, all of that. Those things become much more important.
Yeah. And I will never forget my family systems professor when in grad school. He would always say relationships are stages for growth, right?
Absolutely.
Like you could do a lot of work on your own, but like doing work when you're like with a partner and being triggered in these ways is like exponential.
It's almost like that's when the real work really starts to, like, you do phase one, and that's like the next phases is actually putting them to use. And I think that's it's beautiful, and it's
putting them to use when it's like when you're feeling bad steak, right? And it's hard. You can see my dog in the background. Hi there. It's like one thing to theoretically know I'm enough, and then someone doesn't text you, and like you feel that core wound, and you're like, oh, this feels so different, rather than just like knowing it intellectually.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, this was such an amazing conversation. I am so thankful for you coming on. I really feel like we need a part two about all this, because I think there's so much we can dig into. I just wanted to give everybody kind of an overview of what this attachment theory is, what it looks like in terms of how it comes out in relationship, and the other side of it is as how to grow in it and how to understand how to use this and apply it to relationships and to your own journey of growing and maturing in this life. So, Alexia, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and your wisdom and your knowledge for coming on here and sharing with us.
Thank you for having me. This was an absolute blast.
And how do people get a hold of you if they're interested in your practice, if they're interested in getting to know more about what you do? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on Instagram if you want to follow me at Dr. Alexia H. My website's a really good way. So it's livewellpsychologygroup.com. And I will also give a little plug. I recently created an online course with a nutritionist and a yoga teacher it's just like this holistic, amazing healing course for women called the Self-Healing Toolkit. So if any of that kind of jumps out at you, you could always like DM me on Instagram, send me a message through my website, but would love to connect and chat if anyone has any questions.
Amazing. And we'll put all that in the notes section of the podcast, so you'll have links to everything as well. But again, thank you so much. I so appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.